On a cold October morning in rural Texas, Marcus Webb walked into his barn, expecting to find nothing but hay and horses. Instead, he discovered something that would shatter the carefully constructed walls around his heart. A woman whose very presence carried secrets darker than the bruises covering her skin. When she woke, delirious and trembling, she whispered a name that stopped his blood cold. His wife's name. A wife he'd buried 2 years ago. A wife he'd never known existed in the same way this stranger seemed to know her. In the next hour, Marcus would make a choice that would either destroy what little peace he'd found in his solitude or give him a reason to live again. This is the story of two people bound by a ghost, and how sometimes the person who can save you is the one you never knew you needed to find. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Marcus Webb's boots hit the barn floor. The rhythm was automatic muscle memory, performing its function without requiring thought. He moved through the dimness, his eyes already adjusted to the pre-dawn darkness after 2 years of identical mornings. The horses needed tending. The work never stopped. The work never demanded anything from him beyond basic competence, and that was precisely why he'd stayed out here. 3,000 acres of empty Texas land, where a man could exist without being forced to feel anything at all. Marcus was 43 years old, though the lines on his face suggested someone older. His hair had turned mostly grey at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of genuine labour, not the soft hands of someone who managed workers, but the weathered skin of a man who still did the physical work himself. He preferred it that way, preferred the ache in his shoulders and back to the alternative, which was silence and memory, and the unbearable weight of rooms that echoed with absence. The ranch had been built by his grandfather 70 years ago. A sprawling property outside of a small town called Millbrook, Texas, where everyone knew everyone else's business and nobody bothered asking questions anymore because they'd already decided what they knew about Marcus Webb. He was the man whose wife had died. He was the man who'd retreated into his work. He was the man who'd turned down every invitation back into social life, every attempt at matchmaking by well-meaning neighbors, every gentle suggestion that he might eventually be ready to rejoin the world. What they didn't know, what Marcus had made sure they never knew, was that his wife, Catherine, had been more than just a loss. She'd been a mystery he'd spent 2 years trying to understand, only to realize that understanding her would require asking questions he'd never had the courage to ask when she was alive. The ranch employed 5 full-time workers, but Marcus had structured things so he could work alone during the early mornings. He preferred it. He'd given explicit instructions that nobody was to arrive before 6 in the morning, which gave him his 2 hours of complete solitude before the day's real work began. 2 hours where the only sounds were his boots on wood, the shuffling of horses, the creak of old barn doors, and the persistent silence that had become his closest companion. He was halfway through checking the water troughs when he noticed something wrong. One of the stall doors, the back one, the one he rarely used because it opened onto the least traveled part of the property, was slightly ajar. Not dramatically. Not in a way that someone not paying close attention would notice, but Marcus paid close attention to everything on his property. He always had. It was the only way to catch problems before they became catastrophes. His first thought was that one of the horses had gotten loose. His second was that someone had left the door open yesterday, and he'd simply forgotten. He moved toward the stall with no particular urgency, already mentally running through which horse might have decided to wander and whether they'd gotten into anything dangerous. He wasn't prepared for what he found. The stall was empty of horses, but it wasn't empty of everything. On top of the clean hay he'd laid out yesterday, there was a figure, human, unmoving, covered in a faded brown blanket that looked like it had been through a dozen harsh winters. For a moment, Marcus simply stared, his brain processing the information his eyes were sending, but having difficulty assembling it into anything coherent. There was a woman in his barn. His first instinct was alarm, a trespasser, a potential threat, someone who'd violated the sanctuary he'd so carefully constructed. But that instinct was immediately overridden by something else. Something in the set of her shoulders, the too thin visibility of her, collarbones above the blanket, the way her breathing seemed shallow and labored. This wasn't someone choosing to be here. This was someone who'd come here because she had nowhere else to go. Marcus approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, though part of him wondered if she was even capable of being startled. She looked unconscious. More than unconscious, she looked like someone who'd pushed her body past all reasonable limits and simply quit functioning. Her skin had a greyish cast to it, and her lips were pale. He knelt beside her without fully committing to the action, as if he might still change his mind and walk away. He was good at walking away. He'd become expert at it over the past 2 years. Up close, Marcus could see the damage more clearly. Bruises at various stages of healing covered what he could see of her arms. Some were fresh, the purple-black of recent trauma. Others had faded to sickly yellow and green, suggesting they were days or even weeks old. There were scars, 2 old ones that looked deliberate in their placement, as if someone had taken considerable time and effort to mark this woman's skin as thoroughly as possible. His jaw tightened. He'd seen a lot of things in his life, but this kind of systematic damage, it spoke to a specific kind of cruelty, the kind that took patience, the kind that came from power held over someone with nowhere to escape. Marcus reached out and gently checked her pulse. It was there, steady but slightly rapid, suggesting her body was working hard even in sleep. She was alive, at least. She was breathing. She hadn't given up entirely, even though her appearance suggested she'd come close. He should call the sheriff. He should contact a doctor. He should do any number of logical, reasonable things that a responsible adult would do when finding an injured stranger on their property. Instead, Marcus found himself standing up and walking back toward the house, already mentally cataloguing the supplies. He'd need clean water, the first aid kit he kept in the kitchen, blankets that weren't full of hay. She couldn't stay here in the stall. If she woke and found herself in a barn, confused and injured, it might trigger something dangerous. He was already making decisions for her, already committing to involvement, already breaking the pattern of isolation that had become his identity. The house was a 2-story structure built in the 1972, functional rather than beautiful. Catherine had wanted to renovate it. She'd talked about painting the kitchen cabinets, refinishing the hardwood floors, replacing the aging appliances with something more modern. They'd been married for 17 years, and he'd never acted on any of her suggestions. He'd been so focused on the ranch, on the work, on the daily demands of maintaining 3,000 acres of property, that he'd somehow convinced himself there would always be time later. There was no later. There was only the house exactly as she'd left it, with her coffee mug still on the counter where she'd set it the morning she had her stroke. He'd never washed it, never moved it. It had become part of the landscape of his grief. Marcus grabbed a clean blanket from the linen closet and filled a basin with warm water. He'd learned basic first aid years ago, but he'd never had to apply it with any seriousness. The woman in his barn represented a series of situations he'd successfully avoided for 2 years. Direct engagement with human suffering, with questions he couldn't answer, with responsibility for someone else's well-being. He carried everything back to the barn, moving with purpose now, past the point of second-guessing himself. The woman hadn't moved. She was still in the same position, her breathing still that shallow, labored rhythm that suggested her body was barely functioning. Marcus set the water and blanket beside her and made a decision. He wasn't equipped to help her here in the barn. If she got any worse, if her condition deteriorated, he'd need access to proper equipment. And more than that, she needed comfort. Real beds. Real shelter. Not a horse stall, no matter how clean he kept it. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was. She was taller than he'd initially thought, probably 5'8" or so, but there was almost nothing to her. Whatever circumstances had led to her being in his barn, they'd included deprivation, not enough food, not enough sleep, probably not enough safety. She made a small sound in her throat as he lifted her, something between a whimper and a gasp, but her eyes didn't open. Her body remained limp in his arms, completely trusting him by virtue of unconsciousness. The guest room in his house was on the ground floor. He'd kept it clean out of habit, even though nobody had stayed there since Catherine died. He laid her on the bed carefully, arranging the pillows so her head was elevated slightly. Then he began the work of cleaning her injuries, as gently as possible. Her arms told a story of systematic abuse. The old scars were professional, clean, deliberate, placed where they wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone not looking for them. The newer bruises suggested recent violence, though nothing that appeared to be life-threatening. Someone had beaten her. Someone had done this repeatedly over a long period of time. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he cleaned the worst of the wounds with antiseptic. He found himself making quiet promises to an unconscious woman that she was safe now, that nobody would hurt her here, that she could trust him, even though he knew better than anyone how fragile trust actually was. He was so focused on his work that he almost missed it when her eyes flickered open. They were grey-blue, the color of storm clouds, and they were completely unfocused at first. Her breathing changed, becoming faster, more panicked. Her body tensed for fight or flight, even though neither was possible given her condition. "You're safe," Marcus said immediately, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're in a house, a safe place. My name is Marcus. What's your name?" She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were scanning the room, taking in details with the desperate urgency of someone trying to figure out if they were about to be hurt. Her mouth opened, and Marcus expected her to scream, to demand to know where she was, to fight him. Instead, she whispered a single word, a name, but not her own, Catherine. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He took a step back, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. This woman, this complete stranger covered in bruises and scars, had whispered his dead wife's name as soon as she regained consciousness. Before he could respond, before he could ask the question forming in his throat, her eyes fluttered closed again. Her body went slack, consciousness releasing her back into darkness. But those words remained, hanging in the air between them, like a ghost that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Marcus stood beside the bed, staring at the unconscious woman's face, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. Catherine had been alone most of the time he'd known her. She'd never mentioned close friends or family connections beyond her parents, who'd passed years before they married. She'd been isolated, actually, in many ways, though he'd never really thought about that until after she was gone. Now there was a woman covered in evidence of systematic abuse, sleeping in his house, whispering his dead wife's name like it was the only safe thing her mind could hold on to. Marcus left the room and quietly closed the door behind him. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water he didn't particularly want, and stood at the window, looking out at his ranch, the perfectly ordered world he'd built specifically to keep chaos at a distance. That chaos had just walked, or been carried directly into the firmament, heart of his sanctuary. And despite every instinct he had telling him to call for help, to turn this problem over to professionals, to retreat back into his solitude, Marcus found himself already planning what he'd need to do. She would need clothes, she would need food when she woke, she would need answers, and more than that, she would need safety. She would need him to be braver than he'd been in 2 years. He had no idea if he was capable of that. He had no idea what connection this woman might have had to Catherine. He had no idea what opening this door would ultimately cost him. But as he looked back toward the guest room, Marcus understood that some choices aren't really choices at all. Sometimes they choose you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, watching the clock move through. The hours, Listening for any sound from the guest room, he'd considered calling Sheriff Dennis, but something stopped him. The moment he made that call, the woman would be pulled into a system he didn't trust to protect her. Police reports, questions, possibly being returned to whatever situation had driven her into his barn in the first place. He wasn't naive enough to believe he was better equipped to help her than professionals. But he was old enough to know that professionals didn't always care about the human cost of their procedures. At 6 in the morning, he called Marcus Holloway, one of his ranch hands, and told him not to come in today. He claimed equipment needed maintenance, which was true enough, it always did, but the real reason was simpler. He needed nobody on the property who might ask questions about the truck that hadn't left his driveway or the extra horse he hadn't worked in 2 days. By 7 o'clock, he heard movement from the guest room. Not aggressive. Movement. Just the subtle sounds of someone waking slowly, carefully, as if they were afraid. Sudden motion might shatter something. He waited 15 minutes before approaching the door and knocking softly. "It's Marcus," he called through the wood. "The man from before. I'm coming in, but I'm not a threat, okay?" Silence. Then a voice, rough from disuse and something deeper than simple fatigue. "Don't." He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. "I'm not forcing anything. Just want to make sure you're all right. There's water on the nightstand if you need it. And clothes, I found some that might fit. They belong to my wife, but he trailed off. "They're clean. I left them on the chair." More silence. Then, "Why didn't you call the police?" It was a fair question. The first rational response from her, and it told him something important. She expected to be turned in. She expected betrayal as her default outcome. "Because I don't know your situation," Marcus answered honestly. "And because police reports go into systems, and systems can be searched by people looking for missing persons. If someone's looking for you, I figured you had a reason for not wanting to be found." He heard movement inside the room, the sound of someone sitting up slowly, as if every vertebra in their spine was signaling protest. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different, less defensive, more exhausted. "You can come in." Marcus opened the door and stepped inside, keeping his distance. She was sitting up in bed, the blanket pulled to her chest, her grey eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him understand why she'd looked so terrified when she woke. Those eyes had seen things that taught a person to be afraid. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably mid-30s, though the lines around her eyes and mouth suggested a life that had aged her faster than time alone should have managed. Her dark hair was matted in places, clean in others, suggesting she'd made attempts at basic hygiene at some point recently. Her face was thin, all angles and shadows, but there was a structure to it that suggested she'd been beautiful once, before whatever had happened to her had carved her down to this fragile version. "My name is Sarah," she said, answering a question he hadn't asked yet. "Sarah Mitchell, and before you ask, I don't know your wife. I mean, I didn't know her personally. I know of her." "That's different." Marcus pulled the chair forward and sat, maintaining distance but establishing presence. "How do you know about Catherine?" Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter. "Because the man who did this to me worked for the man who married her. And before you ask who that is, or what any of that means, I need you to understand something. If I tell you what I know, you're going to want to turn me in. You're going to think the right thing to do is contact authorities, and I'm telling you right now that doing that would be a death sentence." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Why?" "Because the man I was with, the man who beat me and kept me in a basement in Houston for 3 years, he has friends, important friends, police friends, political friends, judicial friends. He's had me disappeared from official records so thoroughly that according to every database in the state, I don't exist. My family thinks I'm dead. My old friends think I disappeared because I wanted to. And the only reason I'm alive right now is because I managed to escape while he was out of the house. And I drove 7 hours north in a stolen truck until I ran out of gas about a mile from your property line. Marcus processed this information, feeling the weight of what she was telling him. Who is he? His name is Robert Chambers. He owns a lot of things in Houston, construction companies, real estate development, some hotels. And about 4 years ago, he married a woman named Catherine. I met her exactly once at a charity event he took me to when he wanted to show me off to his friends. She was kind to me. She was the only person at that entire event who looked at me like I was a human being instead of a possession. Catherine was my wife, Marcus said quietly. She died 2 years ago. Stroke. No warning. Sarah's expression shifted. Something like recognition, or perhaps understanding, flickered across her face. I'm sorry. I didn't know she'd passed. I didn't know anything after I disappeared. No news. No contact with the outside world. Just him and the basement and learning to accept that I was never going to leave. But you did leave. He made a mistake, Sarah said, and for the first time there was something like satisfaction in her voice. He always locked the basement door when he left the house. Always. Like it was habit. But one day he didn't. He was angry about something. Something had gone wrong in one of his deals, and he stormed out without his usual routine. I heard the truck leave. I waited an hour to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then I climbed those stairs, and I kept walking. She held out her arm, and Marcus could see the scars more clearly in the daylight, filtering through the window. They weren't random. They were deliberate. They were messages written in flesh, and Marcus didn't need to ask what they meant. He understood what systematic cruelty looked like when he saw it. Why come here? Marcus asked. Why not go to another city, another state? Why drive to a ranch in the middle of nowhere and hide in my barn? Because I remembered Catherine talking about where she grew up. She mentioned a ranch, a place in Texas that meant something to her. She never said a name, but she talked about someone there. Someone she loved. I don't think she meant her husband. There was something different in her voice when she mentioned him. I think she meant... Sarah trailed off, seeming to understand the implication. She meant me, Marcus finished. We were married. She was my wife. I know that now. I didn't before I got here. I was just following the only thread I had. Catherine had been kind to me when I had no reason to expect kindness. And when I escaped, I thought maybe there was someone here who could help me disappear completely. Someone who had nothing to do with Robert's world, who wouldn't be connected to his network. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at his property. The enormity of what Sarah was telling him was beginning to settle into his understanding. Catherine had never mentioned being married to someone else. She'd never hinted at a previous life in Houston. She'd been his wife, and she'd been completely separate from anything having to do with organized crime or wealthy men with control issues. Except she hadn't been separate. She'd been there. She'd been entangled in that world enough to know Sarah, enough to have compassion for her, enough that Sarah would remember her kindness years later in a basement. I need to know something, Marcus said without turning from the window. Was Catherine happy? When she was in that world? When she was around your ex? Was she happy? No, Sarah said simply. She was trapped, like I was, just a different kind of trap, nicer on the surface but still a cage. Marcus closed his eyes. 2 years. He'd spent 2 years being angry at Catherine for dying before they could have real conversations. 2 years assuming her life with him had been complete, that she'd had no secrets, no hidden parts, and the entire time she'd been someone with a whole history he'd never bothered to understand. I'm not turning you in, he said, finally turning back to face Sarah. And I'm not helping you disappear completely because that's not sustainable, but I am going to help you figure out how to be safe, real safe. Not the kind that requires running forever. He'll come looking for me, Sarah warned. When he realizes I'm gone, he'll come looking, and he'll use every resource he has. Then we'd better have a plan before he shows up, Marcus said. But first, you need rest, real rest, and you need food. Your body's running on fumes, and you won't be able to think clearly until that changes." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. A wave of exhaustion crossed her face so visibly that Marcus could see her fighting to keep her eyes open. "I'll bring you breakfast in an hour," he said, "and clean clothes that aren't my dead wife's, and we can start figuring this out together. But right now, you need to sleep, and while you sleep, I'm going to make some calls, careful calls, to people I trust." "You don't know me," Sarah said. "You have no reason to trust me." "No," Marcus agreed. "But Catherine did, and that's enough for now." He was nearly to the door when Sarah's voice stopped him. "Thank you for not sending me away, for believing me. Most people wouldn't." Marcus paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Most people haven't. Had to learn what happens when you ignore the things right in front of you until it's too late to do anything about it." He left her there, closing the door softly behind him, and walked to the kitchen, where he knew Catherine's address book still sat on the shelf above the refrigerator, a place he'd been unable to remove it from. He opened it carefully, looking for the names of people she'd stayed in contact with from her old life, names that might become useful. It was time to stop hiding from his wife's memory. It was time to understand what she'd been running from, and why someone fleeing from that same thing had instinctively known to find her way to him. The questions were beginning to coalesce into something like understanding, and with them came the uncomfortable realization that Catherine's death might not have been as simple as a stroke at all. Marcus spent the rest of the morning going through Catherine's belongings methodically. He'd avoided this task for 2 years, had, in fact, deliberately constructed his life around not having to confront the physical evidence of her existence. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her jewelry box sat on the dresser, her journals, which he'd never opened, occupied the top shelf of the bookcase in their bedroom. He started with the journals. Catherine had kept them since college, leather-bound books with dates stamped on the spines. Marcus had always known they were there. He'd simply chosen not to read them, respecting what he'd assumed was her privacy. But privacy was a luxury he could no longer afford if understanding her past meant keeping Sarah alive. The early entries were innocuous. College experiences, observations about friends, complaints about classes. Then, about halfway through the third journal, the tone shifted. The entries became less about daily life and more about internal conflict. Something was happening that Catherine wasn't ready to fully articulate. He found the name Robert first, appearing casually in an entry dated 15 years ago. "Met someone today. He was confident, successful, exactly the kind of man my mother always said I should marry. Something about him made me uncomfortable, but I can't explain why." Over the subsequent months, Robert's presence in the journals grew more prominent, and the tone became increasingly anxious. Catherine was documenting her own descent into something she didn't fully understand. She'd met Robert through mutual friends at a charity event in Houston. He'd pursued her aggressively. She'd tried to discourage him. He'd persisted. Then came the entry that made Marcus's hands shake. "He proposed today. He said he loved me, that he would take care of me, that I would never have to worry about anything. I said no. He didn't take it well. He said that women like me, independent, difficult, stubborn, just needed the right man to show them what they were meant to be." I've never felt more frightened by a smile. But Catherine had eventually said yes. Marcus found the entry almost a year later. She'd capitulated. The journals didn't explain why, but Marcus could read between the lines: persistent pressure, isolation from friends who questioned the relationship. Financial pressure. Robert had bought her expensive gifts she'd tried to return. The slow, methodical process of someone being worn down until resistance seemed like more effort than surrender. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. For 3 years there was nothing. When they resumed, Catherine's handwriting had changed. It was shakier, less confident. The tone was different, too resigned rather than anxious. "I've decided to leave him," one entry read. I have enough money set aside. I have a plan. But I'm terrified. He's told me what will happen if I try to leave. He's shown me, and I believe him. I've seen what he does to people who disappoint him. But I can't stay. I can't become any smaller than I've already become. That entry was dated 3 months before Catherine died. Marcus sat on the edge of their bed, Catherine's journal open in his lap, and felt something crack open inside him. His wife hadn't died of a stroke. He didn't know that for certain, but he felt it with the kind of certainty that came from finally understanding the shape of a pattern he'd been too blind to see. He called the county coroner's office. "This is Marcus Webb," he said when someone picked up. "My wife Catherine Webb died 2 years ago. I have her death certificate, but I'd like to request her autopsy records." There was a pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Webb, but those records are sealed unless there's an active investigation or legal proceeding. There's new information suggesting her death might not have been natural," Marcus said carefully. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of reopening the case." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have to connect you with the sheriff's office. This isn't something the coroner handles. But Mr. Webb, if you have genuine concerns about the circumstances of your wife's death, you'll need more than suspicions. You'll need evidence." Marcus hung up and sat for a long moment thinking. Evidence. He had suspicions. He had his wife's journals documenting fear and abuse. He had a woman in his guest room who'd been systematically tortured by the same man Catherine had been married to. But none of that was concrete enough to reopen a case that had been closed for 2 years. He needed to talk to Sheriff Dennis. But more than that, he needed to talk to someone who understood the legal system, someone who could navigate the complications of building a case against someone as powerful and connected as Robert Chambers. He called his lawyer, Patricia Navarro, a woman he'd hired to handle property disputes years ago and had barely contacted since. "I need your help," he said when she answered. "But it's complicated, and I need to know if you can work with discretion." Patricia, to her credit, asked minimal questions over the phone. She agreed to meet him at her office in Millbrook that afternoon, on the condition that he bring whatever documentation he had. He packed Catherine's journals into a bag, made sure Sarah had everything she needed, and told her he'd be back by evening. She was resting when he left, but as he walked out the door, he heard her call his name. He turned back. She was sitting up in bed, her grey eyes serious. "Don't do anything reckless," she said. "Robert's not just dangerous because he's violent. He's dangerous because he's intelligent. He understands systems. He understands how to work around them. If you try to go after him directly, he'll find a way to turn it around." "I'm just going to talk to a lawyer," Marcus said. "Gather information." "That's how it starts," Sarah said quietly, "and that's how he becomes aware you're a problem. Be careful, Marcus, please. The last thing I need is to be responsible for something happening to you." Marcus wanted to reassure her, but they both knew reassurance would be a lie. He was already committed to a path that Robert Chambers would see as a threat the moment he found out about it, and Robert would find out. Men like that always did. Patricia's office was in the oldest building in Millbrook, 3rd floor above a bank that had been there for 50 years. Patricia herself was a woman in her late 50s, with steel-grey hair and a reputation for aggressive representation. She'd made her name handling divorces where one party was significantly more powerful than the other. She understood how power got weaponized in intimate relationships. Marcus laid out the journals and told her everything Sarah had told him. Patricia read through the relevant passages slowly, her expression not changing. When she finished, she set the journals down and leaned back in her chair. "This is complicated," she said finally. "What you have here is documentation of psychological abuse spanning years. What you don't have is proof of anything that would justify reopening an investigation into your wife's death. Autopsy results, if they'd been done properly, would have shown whether her stroke was natural or induced. But without those results—" "I'll get them," Marcus interrupted. "I'll request them." "That will tip off your hand," Patricia said. The moment you start asking questions about your wife's autopsy, someone in that chain of command is going to tell Robert Chambers that you're asking, and then he'll know that there's a threat. So what do I do? Patricia stood and walked to her window, looking out at Main Street below. You do nothing obvious. You gather information quietly. You find out if there are other women like Sarah. You build a case slowly, systematically, in a way that Robert doesn't see coming. And you protect Sarah, because if he finds her, he will kill her. Not out of passion, but because she's a loose end that he can't afford to leave untied. Marcus felt the weight of that reality settle over him. He'll come looking for her. Yes, and when he does, he won't come alone. He'll come with lawyers and with people who understand how to make problems disappear. You need to be ready for that. How do I prepare for something like that? Patricia turned from the window. By documenting everything. By making sure that if something happens to you or to Sarah, there's a record that can't be dismissed. By building a network of people who will corroborate what you know. And by understanding that this isn't going to be resolved quickly or easily. This is going to take time and patience and a willingness to live with uncertainty. Marcus left her office an hour later with a list of tasks, legal contacts, and a growing understanding of how deep this situation actually went. Patricia had given him the names of women's advocacy organizations that documented abuse patterns. She'd suggested he connect with a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. She'd outlined a strategy for carefully building a case against Robert without alerting him to the investigation. But underneath all of that practical advice was a simple truth. Marcus was about to make himself a target. He stopped at a grocery store on the way back to the ranch, buying supplies for Sarah, nutritious food, warm clothing, toiletries. Small, practical things that said, "You're going to be here for a while. You're going to be okay." When he arrived back at the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The property looked exactly as it always had, empty, peaceful, isolated. It looked like a place where a man could hide from the world. Sarah was standing on the porch when he pulled up, wrapped in one of Catherine's sweaters, her grey eyes watching the horizon as if she could see danger approaching from miles away. "You went to town," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I talked to a lawyer," Marcus admitted, "and I read Catherine's journals. I know what she was running from, Sarah. And I know it was the same person who hurt you." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then you understand what comes next. He'll figure out that I'm here. And when he does, everything changes." Marcus climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, both of them looking out at the darkening landscape. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "Whatever comes, we'll handle it together." Sarah didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long learning to expect the worst from people. It's hard to believe that someone would choose to stand with me when they have no obligation to." "Catherine chose to be kind to you when she was trapped herself," Marcus said. "That matters. That tells me something about who she was. And it tells me something about who you are, someone worth standing with." As darkness fell completely, Marcus and Sarah stood together on the porch of his ranch, both of them understanding that the quiet they'd found in isolation was about to be violently interrupted. But for now, in this moment between what was coming, they were simply two people who'd chosen to stop running. And that choice, Marcus was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous thing either of them could have made. A week passed, in an odd rhythm of normalcy and underlying tension. Marcus had told his ranch hands that he was dealing with personal matters and didn't want visitors. Most didn't question it. Ranch work had its own demands, and men who worked that kind of land understood that everyone carried their own burdens privately. Sarah's physical condition improved noticeably. The bruises began to fade from violent purples to sickly yellows. Her weight started coming back as she ate regular meals for the first time in years. But the real transformation was something less visible. The constant vigilance in her eyes began to ease, replaced by something approaching something like cautious hope. They developed routines. In the mornings, Marcus would work the property while Sarah remained indoors, visible to no one. She spent her time reading from his bookshelves, learning the details of his life through what he'd chosen to keep. She discovered that he loved history, that he had a weakness for old Western novels, that he kept photographs of his family scattered throughout the house but had never looked at them since Catherine died. In the afternoons, when Marcus came in from work, they would sit on the back porch where they were shielded from view of the main road. Sarah would tell him stories about her life before Robert, about her family in Austin, about dreams she'd had before everything collapsed. Marcus would listen and sometimes share his own memories of Catherine, trying to reconcile the woman he'd known with the terrified version documented in her journals. It was on the 8th day that Marcus noticed the vehicle, a dark sedan parked about a quarter-mile down the road, partially hidden by a thicket of oak trees. It was still enough that Marcus almost missed it, but he'd grown up on this land, and he knew what belonged and what didn't. That vehicle didn't belong. He didn't mention it to Sarah immediately. Instead, he went about his work as normal, but with heightened awareness. He moved around the property in ways that would have been natural if he were simply managing his ranch, but which also positioned him to observe the vehicle without being obviously observed in return. By evening, the sedan was gone, but it had been replaced by a different vehicle, a grey pickup truck parked on the opposite side of the property, beyond the tree line but with clear sightlines to the house. Marcus's phone rang at 9 o'clock that night. It was Patricia Navarro. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I've been contacted by a representative of Robert Chambers's legal team. They're asking questions about whether you might have harbored a fugitive. They're not directly accusing you of anything, but the implication is clear." Marcus felt his stomach drop. How did they find out? That's the question, isn't it? Either someone in town saw something and word got back to Chambers, or he's been watching this property and spotted Sarah at some point. Either way, he knows she's there, and he's starting to apply pressure. "What kind of pressure? The kind that comes before the physical kind," Patricia said grimly. "Harassment charges, false accusations, legal threats. He's building a foundation for whatever comes next, and he's doing it through lawyers instead of through violence, which means he's thinking long-term. He doesn't want to just get Sarah back. He wants to discredit anyone who might testify against him." After hanging up, Marcus went to find Sarah. She was in the guest room reading, but she set the book down immediately when she saw his expression. "They know," she said. "Not a question. His legal team is asking questions, and there are vehicles watching the property." Sarah stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain carefully. "We should leave. I should go. I've brought nothing but danger into your life, and—" "No," Marcus interrupted. "Running is what he expects. Running is how he controls the situation. If you run, you're admitting guilt. You're confirming that there's something to hide. We're not running. Then what do we do?" Marcus had spent the last week thinking about this exact question. "We document everything. We make sure that anything Robert does from this point forward is witnessed and recorded. And we stop hiding." Sarah looked at him like he'd suggested something insane. "Stop hiding? Marcus, he'll kill me. Not if there are too many people paying attention, not if his actions are public instead of private. That's what he's good at, operating in shadows, where things disappear. We take this out of the shadows." Over the next 2 days, Marcus implemented a plan that Patricia had outlined for him. He contacted the local news station in the nearest city, about 40 miles away. He told them he had a story about human trafficking and systematic abuse that involved prominent members of the business community. He didn't name names, not yet. But he piqued their interest enough that a reporter agreed to come out to the ranch for preliminary interviews. He also reached out to several women's advocacy organizations and gave them copies of Catherine's journals and the documentation Patricia had begun compiling. He made sure that the information was distributed to multiple sources in a way that meant if something happened to him or Sarah, the information wouldn't disappear. And he moved Sarah. Not out of the house entirely, but into view. He had her sit on the front porch during daylight hours. He had her work in the garden that Catherine had maintained before she died. He made her presence visible, but he also made sure that security cameras installed over the course of 3 days, while the surveillance vehicles continued their watch, were recording everything. Sarah was terrified by the strategy at first, but as days passed and nothing happened, she began to understand what Marcus was doing. He was turning her from a ghost into a person. He was making her real in a way that Robert couldn't erase. On the 10th day after Patricia's warning call, Robert Chambers himself arrived at the property. Marcus saw the limousine approaching from half a mile away. It was impossible to miss pristine black, completely out of place on the rural roads leading to the ranch. The driver parked it at the front gate, and Robert emerged. He was exactly what Marcus had imagined from Catherine's descriptions, tall, handsome, in the way that comes from expensive grooming and easy confidence. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his smile was the kind that made you want to trust him immediately. The smile of someone who'd learned that charm was a more effective weapon than violence. Marcus was waiting for him on the porch. Sarah was inside, safely behind locked doors, and with access to the panic button that Patricia had insisted on installing. "Mr. Webb," Robert said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Chambers. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Marcus didn't shake his hand. "Sarah Mitchell doesn't belong to anyone, and she's not going anywhere with you." Robert's smile never wavered. "I think you're confused about the situation. Sarah is a very troubled woman. She has a history of mental instability. She's accused me of things that have no basis in reality. And now she's manipulated a lonely man into harboring her. It's actually quite tragic." "I've read Catherine's journals," Marcus said. "I know what you did to her, and I know what you've been doing to Sarah. The only person whose story is fabricated is yours." The smile finally faded. Robert's eyes went cold, and Marcus saw the man underneath the polish. It was a man without mercy, without genuine empathy, without anything resembling a conscience. "You're making a serious mistake," Robert said quietly. "Catherine was never strong enough to handle the life I was offering her. And Sarah, well, Sarah has always been mentally unstable. It's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility. But you, Mr. Webb, you're making choices that will have real consequences." "I'm documenting those consequences," Marcus replied. "Every conversation we have is being recorded. Every vehicle that's been watching my property is documented. And if anything happens to me or to Sarah, there's a chain of evidence that leads directly to you. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back in your limousine. You're going to leave this property, and you're going to accept that Sarah is done living in your control." Robert studied Marcus for a long moment, and Marcus saw him calculating odds and outcomes. Finally, he smiled. Again, but this time it was different. It was the smile of someone who decided to take a longer view. "You think you're protecting her," Robert said, "but all you've done is make her more valuable as a problem that needs solving. She was safe when she was hidden. Now that she's visible, now that you've made her a public matter, you've made her a target. Whatever happens next is on you." He turned and walked back to his limousine, and Marcus watched it drive away down the long driveway. He went immediately inside and found Sarah in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Did he?" she started. "He's gone," and everything he said was recorded. Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and terror. "He meant what he said, Marcus. Now that he knows we're not backing down, now that he knows I'm not going to just disappear, he'll escalate. He'll bring in people who understand violence better than he does. I know," Marcus interrupted. "Which is why we're not done preparing. We're just getting started. Over the next week, The reality of what Robert had implied began to manifest. There were incidents. A pipe burst on the property that destroyed the water system. Later examination would show it had been deliberately weakened. A truck arriving with a delivery they hadn't ordered, the driver disappearing before questions could be asked. Subtle things, but things designed to suggest that Robert's reach extended further than Marcus had anticipated. But they were also things that could be documented. Things that could be photographed, reported to police, added to the growing dossier of evidence. Patricia brought in a security expert, a man named David Chen, who had worked with law enforcement on organized crime cases. He reviewed the ranch's vulnerabilities and made recommendations. He also brought something else: information. Robert Chambers has been linked to at least 5 other women who've disappeared. Over the past decade, Chen told them during a meeting in Marcus's living room. The authorities haven't been able to prove anything because those women have no advocates. But Sarah changes that. She's alive. She can testify, which means Robert is going to get desperate. And desperate men make mistakes. How desperate? Sarah asked quietly. Desperate enough that he might try something direct instead of continuing with intimidation. Desperate enough that he might decide the risk of direct action is less than the risk of letting you testify. Marcus reached for Sarah's hand. Then we make sure she's never alone. We make sure there's always a witness. We make sure that if he tries anything, there's undeniable proof. And, in the meantime, Chen added, we gather more evidence. We talk to the other women's families. We start building the foundation for something much larger than a single case. We turn this into the kind of crime that law enforcement can't ignore, no matter how many judges or politicians Robert has in his pocket. That night, as Marcus and Sarah sat on the back porch watching the stars, Sarah spoke words she'd been afraid to voice before. Do you think we can actually win this, or is this just postponing the inevitable? Marcus was honest. I don't know, but I know that we have a better chance together than either of us would have apart, and I know that Catherine would have wanted us to fight. So we fight. Not because victory is guaranteed, but because the alternative surrender guarantees loss. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since escaping Robert's basement, she allowed herself to believe that survival might actually be possible. But both of them understood that the price of that survival would be higher than either had yet paid. 3 weeks after Robert's visit, Sarah had a breakdown. It happened quietly, at 2 a.m, when Marcus found her standing in the kitchen staring at nothing, her hands trembling so severely that she couldn't pour water into a glass. He guided her to a chair, and she collapsed into it like a marionette whose strings had been cut. "What happened?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her. "Nothing happened," she whispered. "That's the problem. He's not doing anything. And that scares me more than if he was." Marcus understood. The waiting was its own form of torture. After decades of chaos and violence, the silence had become unbearable. Sarah's nervous system had learned to expect attack. The absence of attack was creating a panic response her body couldn't suppress. "Talk to me," Marcus said. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone else." Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. But then she began speaking, and the words came in a torrent, story after story, that she'd never shared because she'd never had anyone safe enough to share them with. She told him about the first time Robert hurt her. It wasn't dramatic. He'd criticized how she'd prepared dinner, said the sauce was too acidic, and when she'd offered to make it again, he'd grabbed her wrist and twisted until she felt something pop in her forearm. He'd held it twisted for 10 seconds, long enough for her to understand he could break it if he wanted to. Then he'd released her and kissed her forehead, telling her he was just helping her understand that small mistakes had consequences. She told him about learning not to have preferences, learning not to speak unless spoken to, learning that Robert's moods could shift without warning, that kindness one moment could become cruelty the next. She told him about the systematic isolation, how he'd convinced her parents that she was better off not having contact with them, how he'd separated her from every friend, every support system, until she existed in a world that consisted of nothing but him. And she told him about the basement. When Robert had started keeping her there, it had been presented as punishment. She'd questioned one of his decisions, suggesting an alternative approach to a business problem. For that transgression, she'd been locked in the basement for 3 days with minimal food and water. It was supposed to teach her respect. Instead, the basement had become her residence for the final year of her captivity. Robert had tried to convince himself and her that it was practical, that he was protecting her from the dangerous outside world, that she was safer with him, contained, controlled, unable to leave and hurt herself or embarrass him. "I stopped fighting after the first 6 months," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "I stopped hoping for escape. I stopped planning. I just existed, got smaller, quieter, learned to be nothing." Marcus listened without interrupting, understanding that this wasn't a story that needed his input. It was a story that needed to be released into the world, given voice, transformed from secret trauma into spoken truth. The thing that kept me sane was thinking about Catherine," Sarah continued. "That one moment I'd met her, when she'd treated me like a person instead of a possession. I'd replay that conversation over and over in my mind. She'd ask me about my family, about where I grew up, about my dreams before I met Robert. And when I answered, she actually listened. She looked at me like my words mattered, like I mattered. "You do matter," Marcus said quietly. "I know that now, but I didn't know it then. I was disappearing day by day. By the time I escaped, I barely recognized myself." Sarah looked at her hands, turning them over as if they belonged to someone else. "The scars aren't just from Robert's hands, Marcus. Some of them are from me. When the pain got unbearable and I couldn't escape it physically, I created a different kind of pain. Something I could control. Something that was mine." Marcus felt the weight of that admission settle between them. This wasn't a woman broken by external forces alone. This was someone who'd been so profoundly damaged that she'd internalized the violence and turned it on herself. "I'm glad you escaped," he said finally. "I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad Catherine showed you kindness, because that kindness kept you alive. It gave you something to hold on to." Sarah's eyes finally met his. "Why are you doing this, Marcus? Really? You could have turned me in. You could have protected yourself. You could have lived quietly without any of this." "Because isolation doesn't heal anything," Marcus said. "I've spent 2 years isolated since Catherine died, and all it did was let me build a story in my head where I was a victim of circumstance, where I wasn't responsible for the fact that my wife was suffering, and I didn't see it. But I did see it. I just chose not to look too closely, and that choice allowed her suffering to continue." He sat down beside her, taking her hand. "When you showed up, delirious and covered in bruises, I was given a second chance, a chance to actually see someone and actually help instead of pretending I didn't notice. I'm not going to waste that." Over the next week, Sarah's mental state continued to deteriorate, even as her physical health improved. The trauma that she'd suppressed for so long, the emotions she'd locked away to survive, were beginning to emerge. She'd have panic attacks at unexpected moments. Sounds would trigger flashbacks. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares. Marcus learned to recognize the signs. He'd stay with her during the attacks, talking her through them, reminding her of where she was and that she was safe. He'd learned to hold her without restraining her, to be present without trying to fix her. What he discovered, in the process, was that love wasn't what he'd thought it was. He'd loved Catherine, but their love had been built on patterns and comfort rather than true understanding. Love, he was learning with Sarah, meant seeing someone at their absolute worst and choosing to stay. It meant accepting that healing wasn't linear. It meant understanding that progress wasn't measured in dramatic transformations, but in small moments of peace. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning with unexpected news. "We found another victim," she said. She came forward after seeing a press release about the case. "Her name is Jennifer Hayes, and she was in a relationship with Chambers for 2 years before she managed to escape. She's willing to testify." "What's her condition?" Marcus asked. "Similar to Sarah's, but with different specifics. Physical abuse, psychological manipulation, isolation. She wants to speak with Sarah before making any official statements." Marcus arranged for Jennifer to come to the ranch on a Friday evening. She was a woman in her early 40s, with dark circles under her eyes and the same hypervigilance that Sarah carried. But there was also a steelness to her, a determination that came from having fought her way back to functionality. The moment Sarah saw her, she began to cry. "You made it out," Sarah said. "I wasn't sure if anyone else had made it out." "I almost didn't," Jennifer replied. "I tried twice and failed. The third time, I planned better. I was smarter about it. But if I'd known there were others, if I'd known I wasn't alone, I think I might have tried sooner." They sat together for hours, two women exchanging the details of their shared nightmare. And as Marcus listened to them speak, he realized something fundamental about trauma and recovery. It wasn't something you could fix alone. It required witnesses. It required community. It required the presence of other people who understood. That night, after Jennifer had left and Sarah had finally fallen asleep, Marcus sat on the porch and called Patricia. "How many more are there?" he asked. "We're up to 8 now, and we're still investigating. David thinks there could be more that Chambers was successful in covering up, but these 8 are enough. Combined with Catherine's journals and Sarah's testimony, we have a case. A real case." "When?" Marcus asked. "When do we move forward with it? That depends on you and Sarah. We can go to the authorities now, start official proceedings, or we can give it another month, build it up even more ironclad. The trade-off is that during that month, you and Sarah remain in danger. But if we move too quickly, Robert might use connections to bury it again." Marcus knew there was no good answer. Either they moved forward and risked being exposed to Robert's retaliation, or they waited and extended their own vulnerability. There was no path that didn't involve risk. "Give me a week to talk to Sarah," he said finally. "We'll decide together." When Marcus told Sarah about the 8 women, about the growing case, about the decision that needed to be made, she was silent for a long time. "If I testify," she said carefully, "there's no going back. Everyone will know what I am. Everyone will know what happened to me. Yes, and there's a chance it won't work. There's a chance Robert's lawyers will find ways to discredit me. There's a chance he'll still walk free." "That's possible," Marcus acknowledged. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. "But if I don't testify, if I stay silent, then he keeps doing this to other women, and I become complicit in their suffering. You're not responsible for his choices. But I could stop him. We could stop him. And that's different than just surviving." Marcus came to stand beside her. "What do you want to do?" Sarah turned to face him, and her expression was resolved. "I want to testify. I want to stop running. I want to stand up and say what he did, and I want to watch him face consequences for it. And I'm terrified. But I want to do it anyway." Marcus pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest. "Then that's what we'll do, together." What neither of them knew was that Robert Chambers had stopped waiting. He'd decided that direct legal action wasn't going to achieve his goals. He'd decided that some problems required more permanent solutions. And he'd hired someone who specialized in making people disappear. The person he'd hired was currently sitting in a diner 40 miles away, looking at photographs of Marcus Webb's ranch, studying its vulnerabilities, and planning the best approach for turning a liability into a corpse that could be explained away as a tragic accident. It would happen soon. Robert had grown tired of patience, and Marcus and Sarah were about to learn that sometimes courage isn't enough. Sometimes you need luck. Sometimes you need allies willing to stand with you when the real danger finally arrives. But they had those allies. They had Patricia, they had David Chen, they had Jennifer Hayes and 7 other women waiting to testify. They had a community that had begun to pay attention. And on that cold night in late November, as Marcus and Sarah held each other in the house that had been his refuge, they had each other, which wasn't everything, but it was the thing that made everything else possible. The attack came on a Saturday morning when Marcus was least prepared for it. He'd been checking fences on the eastern edge of the property, the part of the ranch that bordered public land. Sarah was inside the house with strict instructions to lock all doors and stay near the panic button. Marcus had established a routine of checking in every 2 hours. It was 9:47 inches the morning when he realized his radio wasn't working. At first, he assumed it was a battery issue. These things happened. But as he tried multiple times to reach the house, he felt something shift in his intuition. Something was wrong. He started moving back toward the house, increasing his pace. He was still half a mile away when he saw the vehicle parked near the access road. He rarely used a battered pickup truck that definitely didn't belong to anyone he knew. Marcus pulled his own truck to the side of the road and proceeded on foot, moving through the pine trees that provided cover. As he got closer, he saw the man. Mid-30s, athletic build, the kind of stillness that came from professional training. He was standing at the tree line, looking at the house, and Marcus could see the outline of a gun beneath his jacket. This was the hitman. This was the consequence of Sarah's decision to testify. Marcus's military training was decades old, but muscle memory doesn't fade. He moved quietly, using the terrain for cover, positioning himself behind a large oak tree where he had a view of both the man and the house. His phone was still in his pocket. He carefully pulled it out and texted Patricia, "Threat on property, armed male, attempting intervention." He didn't wait for a response. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. The man was patient, methodical. He was studying the house's layout, checking angles, apparently waiting for something. Marcus understood what he was waiting for Sarah to approach a window, to give him a clear shot. The hitman had probably been instructed to make it look like a robbery gone wrong or a suicide. Something that wouldn't obviously connect back to Robert Chambers. Marcus had to act before that moment came. He made a noise, deliberately snapping a branch beneath his boot, and watched the man's head snap toward the sound. In that second, Marcus moved. Not toward the man, but toward the house, running hard across the open space between the tree line and the back entrance. The first shot came close enough that Marcus heard it pass near his head. The second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him slightly but not stopping him. He reached the back door and burst through, immediately locking it behind him and moving away from the window. "Sarah!" he shouted. "Front room now!" She appeared within seconds, her face going pale when she saw the blood spreading across his shoulder. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing her hand. "Now, no arguments." They moved through the house toward the kitchen where Marcus kept supplies. He grabbed his truck keys and a bag he'd packed weeks ago, documents, cash, emergency supplies, and guided Sarah toward the garage. Behind them, he heard glass breaking as the hitman tested entry points. Marcus had anticipated this. He'd had David Chen install reinforced doors and secondary locks. It would buy them minutes, not hours, but minutes were all they needed. He got Sarah into his truck and reversed out of the garage, accelerating hard down the back road that led away from the property. In his mirror, he saw the hitman emerge from the house, but they were already too far away for accurate fire. "Your shoulder," Sarah said, reaching for him. "I'm okay. We need to get to the safe house." The safe house was Patricia's idea. She'd arranged a property about an hour away. A cabin owned by a friend, stocked with supplies and deliberately kept off public records. The plan had always been that if things went sideways before the case went to trial, they'd retreat there and wait for law enforcement to catch up. Marcus drove with one hand, trying not to lose blood too quickly. The bullet had gone through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing major arteries by what felt like centimeters. It hurt, but pain was secondary to survival. "This is my fault," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I made the decision to testify, and now—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted. "This is not your fault. This is Robert's fault. He's the one who hired someone to kill us. We're the ones fighting back." "That's different." He called Patricia as he drove, keeping one eye on the road and the other on his mirror. "We're heading to the cabin," he told her. "There was an armed operative at the property. I managed to create distance, but I caught a round in the shoulder. Not critical, but I need medical attention once we're secure. I'm calling the sheriff now," Patricia said, "and I'm getting law enforcement to secure your property. Marcus, what you did, confronting an armed killer that was extraordinarily dangerous. Leaving Sarah alone in the house would have been more dangerous," Marcus replied. The cabin was set back in the woods, accessible only by a winding dirt road. Marcus pulled into the driveway and immediately moved Sarah inside, securing the doors and checking the perimeter. Only once he was certain they were as safe as the situation allowed did he let his adrenaline fade. Sarah immediately began working on his shoulder. She'd learned basic first aid during her time with Marcus, and she moved with careful competence, cleaning the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, and fashioning a proper bandage with supplies from the cabin's medical kit. "This needs professional attention," she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. "It will get it," Marcus promised. "But not until we know the sheriff's response." It turned out that Robert Chambers' hiring of a hitman was the break Patricia needed. Law enforcement took attempted murder seriously, especially when it was so blatantly connected to a case. By evening, federal agents had arrived on scene, had secured Marcus's property, and had begun the process of tracking the hitman. More importantly, they'd found evidence connecting the killer directly to Robert Chambers. A phone call made from a burner number to another burner number traced through cell tower records. A wire transfer that could be connected to shell companies Robert owned. It was enough. By midnight, Robert Chambers had been arrested. The federal agents who came to the cabin were professional and thorough. They took statements from both Marcus and Sarah, photographed Marcus's shoulder wound, and assured them that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Robert was in federal custody. The hitman had been apprehended at a motel 30 miles away. "You're safe," the lead agent told them. "Both of you. We still need your testimony for the larger case, but the immediate danger is over." After the agents left, Marcus and Sarah sat in the cabin's small living room, processing what had just happened. Marcus's shoulder throbbed, and he knew he'd need to see a doctor soon for proper treatment. But more than the physical pain, there was something else, a kind of shock at how quickly their normal could transform into immediate danger. "He really tried to have us killed," Sarah said quietly. "He actually hired someone to make us disappear." "Yes," Marcus said. There was no point in softening it. "That means he's dangerous in a way I already knew, but somehow seeing it acted out, seeing someone actually come to kill us, it makes it real in a different way." Marcus pulled her close, careful of his injured shoulder. "We survived, both of us, and now he's going to face actual justice for what he's done. That matters." Over the next 3 days, as Marcus's shoulder healed under professional medical supervision, the larger case against Robert Chambers began to take shape. Patricia contacted all 8 victims. 7 agreed to testify. Jennifer Hayes, who had the most documented history of abuse, became the lead witness. The prosecutor, a woman named Elizabeth Morris, who had built her career on cases involving organized abuse, was methodical and determined. She understood that Robert would use every legal maneuver available to him. She knew he had resources to hire the best defense team money could buy, but she also understood something fundamental. He'd made a mistake. By ordering a hit, he'd created evidence that was undeniable, and that mistake had opened doors that his money and connections couldn't close. "We're going to trial in 6 weeks," Patricia told Marcus and Sarah. Robert's bail was denied because of the threat he poses. He's going to be held without bail until trial. During those 6 weeks, the prosecutor will depose all of the witnesses. Your testimony will be crucial, but Jennifer's will be the backbone of the case. Multiple victims, consistent patterns of abuse, and now attempted murder. It's solid. What's his defense going to be? Sarah asked. He'll claim consensual relationships, that the abuse allegations are exaggerated or fabricated, that the murder for hire was arranged by a disgruntled employee trying to frame him. Standard moves. But his defense is weakened by the fact that he's been caught red-handed, ordering a hit on someone he knows is about to testify against him. That's consciousness of guilt. The weeks leading up to trial were strange. Marcus and Sarah existed in a kind of limbo, no longer in immediate danger but not yet at resolution either. They returned to the ranch, which had been thoroughly cleaned and secured by law enforcement. The bullet holes in the house were left as evidence until after trial, serving as a constant reminder of how close they'd come. But there was also normalcy. Marcus hired workers to begin repairs. Sarah's physical health continued to improve. She started exploring the possibility of vocational training, of building a life beyond survival. They fell into a rhythm of waiting, of preparing for the testimony that would define whether justice was actually possible. One evening, about 3 weeks before trial, Sarah asked Marcus a question he wasn't prepared for. What happens to us after this is over? After Robert is convicted? If he's convicted, what do we do? Marcus had been asking himself the same question. What do you want to happen? I want to stay, Sarah said simply, not because I'm trapped or because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose to. Because for the first time in my life, I've found something that feels like home. I've found someone who sees me as a full person, not as a possession or a problem or a charity case. I want to build a life here. With you. If that's what you want. Marcus thought about Catherine, about the marriage that had been comfortable but incomplete. He thought about the 2 years of isolation that had nearly destroyed him. He thought about Sarah showing up in his barn like a ghost that needed to become real. I want that too, he said. Not someday, now, even before the trial is over. I want to start building that with you. Sarah smiled, and for the first time it was a smile that came from genuine joy rather than relief or gratitude. Then we do it, she said. Whatever comes next, we do it together. What neither of them knew was that the trial would bring complications they hadn't anticipated. Robert's defense team would be more aggressive than expected. Some of the other victims would struggle under cross-examination, and there would be a moment when it seemed like justice might actually slip through their fingers. But for now, in the quiet of the ranch, with the land spreading out around them, Marcus and Sarah allowed themselves to believe that they'd done enough. That by fighting, by refusing to disappear, by choosing to stand against someone more powerful and better connected, they'd changed something fundamental. They didn't know the outcome yet, but they knew they'd earned the right to hope for one. The courthouse in Houston was a sterile, imposing structure of glass and steel, nothing like the small-town buildings Sarah had known. Marcus sat beside her in the gallery, his presence a steady anchor as she gripped her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The trial had begun 3 days ago. Prosecutor Elizabeth Morris had spent the opening arguments laying out the pattern. Multiple victims, systematic abuse, escalating control, and ultimately an attempt on Marcus and Sarah's lives when Robert sensed that his hold on power was slipping. It was methodical and compelling. But Robert's defense team was methodical too. They were led by Derek Thornton, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for dismantling abuse narratives through aggressive cross-examination. His strategy was becoming clear as each witness took the stand. Plant doubt, suggest collusion, imply that the women had ulterior motives, financial gain, revenge, attention-seeking. Jennifer Hayes had testified yesterday. She'd been composed and detailed, describing years of abuse with painful specificity. But Thornton had spent 4 hours systematically attacking her credibility. He suggested she'd exaggerated injuries for sympathy. He highlighted moments in her narrative that seemed inconsistent, and implied that inconsistency meant the entire story was fabricated. He asked questions designed to shame her. Isn't it true that you initially tried to return to Mr. Chambers after your first escape? And didn't you continue to accept financial support from Mr. Chambers even after you left? Sarah had watched Jennifer's composure crack under the assault. By the end of her testimony, Jennifer looked defeated, not because her story was false, but because the legal system seemed designed to make the truth sound like a lie if you questioned it aggressively enough. Now, it was Sarah's turn. She was sworn in wearing clothes that Patricia had helped her choose, modest, conservative, designed to appear sympathetic rather than provocative. But she knew that none of that would matter. Robert Thornton had an agenda, and that agenda was to make her look like a liar or a victim of her own delusions. Prosecutor Morris went first, guiding Sarah through her story with care and respect. She established the timeline of Sarah's relationship with Robert, documented the progression of abuse, and let Sarah describe in her own words the 3 years in the basement. Under Morris's questioning, the courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward slightly. The jury's expressions shifted from neutral to horrified. This was the truth being heard. This was what had actually happened. Then came the cross-examination. Thornton stood slowly, making the movement theatrical. He approached Sarah with an expression that appeared sympathetic but felt predatory. "Miss Mitchell, you claim that Mr. Chambers kept you in a basement for 3 years. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sarah answered, keeping her voice steady. "Yet you were seen leaving the house on at least 15 occasions during that 3-year period. There are witnesses who saw you at grocery stores, at restaurants, even at a movie theater. How do you explain that?" Sarah had known this was coming. "I was taken out under supervision. Robert needed to maintain the appearance that everything was normal, that I was his girlfriend, not his prisoner." "So you went to public places and made no attempt to escape? You didn't speak to anyone? You didn't try to get help?" "I was too afraid," Sarah said. "You don't understand what living under that kind of control." "I'm asking you a simple question," Thornton interrupted. "Why didn't you escape?" Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. How did you explain the paralysis of fear to someone who'd never experienced it? How did you make someone understand that when a person has systematically broken you down, when you've internalized the belief that you deserve what's happening, that any escape attempt will result in worse punishment? How did you articulate that in a way that satisfied legal requirements for coherence and consistency? "Because I was trapped," she said finally, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Trapped in what sense? You were physically free to leave whenever you chose." "No, I wasn't. Robert had made it clear what would happen if I tried to leave. He'd shown me. He'd hurt me in ways I couldn't hide from." Thornton nodded slowly, as if Sarah had just confirmed something important. "You have extensive scarring on your body, correct?" "Yes. Some of these scars, according to the medical examination, are approximately 4 to 5 years old, before you even met Mr. Chambers. Isn't that true?" Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew what he was doing. Some of them are self-inflicted. "Before I met Robert, I was struggling with—" "So you have a documented history of harming yourself," Thornton said, his voice carrying a note of concern that felt performative. "A history of emotional instability. And yet the court is supposed to believe that all of your injuries resulted from Mr. Chambers's violence? No. I'm saying that I had mental health struggles before, but Robert weaponized those struggles. He used my vulnerabilities. Miss Mitchell, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Is it possible that your injuries, the scars that you're attributing to Mr. Chambers, could have resulted from your own self-harm rather than from any actions on his part. Prosecutor Morris stood immediately. Objection. Counsel is making an assumption not supported by testimony. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Thornton, rephrase. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the implication. They were now questioning whether Sarah's injuries proved anything at all. For the next 6 hours, Thornton took apart Sarah's narrative piece by piece. He highlighted inconsistencies in timelines. He suggested she was misremembering events. He implied that she'd fabricated details to make Robert's behavior seem more monstrous than it actually was. He suggested that her relationship with Marcus was new and potentially manipulative, that she'd latched onto him as a convenient rescuer for a woman with a documented history of unstable attachments. By the time Sarah was excused from the stand, she felt hollowed out. She'd told the truth. She'd been as accurate as possible about what she'd experienced. And yet somehow, through the systematic application of legal strategy, her truth had been transformed into something questionable. That evening, back at the hotel where the prosecution had arranged for Sarah and Marcus to stay during trial, Sarah collapsed into bed and couldn't speak for hours. Marcus sat beside her, understanding that there was nothing he could say that would make this better. "He was good," Sarah finally said, her voice hoarse. "The defense attorney. He didn't deny anything. He just made it seem like what I remembered couldn't be trusted, like my suffering might be something I did to myself, like I'm not a reliable narrator of my own life." "You are reliable," Marcus said. "What he did was a trick, a legal technique designed to confuse juries. But it worked. I could see them questioning me. I could see doubt in their faces." Over the next week, 3 more victims testified, and the pattern repeated. Thornton would methodically dismantle each woman's narrative, suggesting that memories were unreliable, that abuse was often subjective, that the women might be exaggerating or misinterpreting normal relationship dynamics. He'd paint pictures of women with emotional problems, unstable histories, or financial motivations for testifying. By the end of the victim testimony, Sarah was terrified that a not guilty verdict was becoming inevitable. She voiced this fear to Patricia during a break in the proceedings. "Don't lose hope yet," Patricia said. "We have physical evidence. We have the attempted murder. We have the phone records connecting Robert to the hitman. The defense can cast doubt on the abuse testimony, but they can't explain away the attempt on your life." "But he'll just claim his employee did it without authorization," Sarah said. "He'll say he's a victim of someone else's crime." Patricia's expression tightened. "That's possible. But there's more. We have forensic accountants who've traced the money flow. We have testimony from Robert's ex-business partner who's willing to go on record about witnessing Robert's abuse of previous girlfriends. The prosecution has tools beyond just victim testimony." The turning point came during prosecution rebuttal when Elizabeth Morris called Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic psychologist who specialized in intimate partner abuse. Dr. Chen had reviewed all of the victim statements, the medical records, and the patterns of behavior documented across multiple relationships spanning a decade. "What I'm seeing, Doctor," Chen testified, "is a consistent and escalating pattern of abusive behavior. Mr. Chambers doesn't abuse in isolation. He abuses systematically, methodically, across multiple relationships, across years. The consistency of these patterns, the isolation, the gaslighting, the introduction of physical violence after establishing psychological control, the escalation when a victim attempts to leave, these aren't signs of women with emotional problems. These are textbook indicators of predatory behavior by the abuser." Thornton tried to dismantle her testimony, but Dr. Chen was a professional who'd spent her career studying precisely this phenomenon. She remained calm and coherent, explaining how abuse victims' memories often contained inconsistencies because trauma fragmented memory. She explained how self-harm could coexist with partner abuse. She explained how victims often initially seemed unreliable because they'd learned to minimize their own suffering and doubt their own perceptions. The victims in this case Dr. Chen concluded, are remarkably consistent in their descriptions of Mr. Chambers's behavior. The minor differences in their accounts actually strengthen the prosecution's case because they show that these women weren't coordinating their stories. They were independently describing the same pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution also presented evidence about the attempted murder attempt that was harder to explain away. They presented phone records, financial transactions, and testimony from the hitman himself, who, facing life imprisonment, had decided to cooperate and testify that Robert Chambers had explicitly ordered Sarah and Marcus killed. By the end of the trial, the prosecution had presented a compelling narrative. Robert Chambers was a predator who systematically abused women, and when those women threatened to expose him, he ordered their murder. The defense rested without calling Robert Chambers to the stand, a decision that suggested his defense team understood how damaging his testimony would be. Closing arguments took place on a Tuesday morning. Elizabeth Morris was passionate and precise, laying out the evidence methodically. Derek Thornton countered with rhetoric about reasonable doubt and the dangers of believing accusers without overwhelming corroboration. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During those 3 days, Sarah found herself unable to eat or sleep. Marcus stayed with her, but even his presence couldn't alleviate the anxiety. She'd experienced injustice before. She knew it was possible for a person to do something terrible and face no consequences. She knew that the legal system wasn't guaranteed to deliver justice, no matter how much. Evidence existed. On the evening of the 3rd day, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed. Sarah sat beside Marcus, her hand gripping his so tightly that her nails dug into his palm. The judge entered. The jury filed in. Sarah couldn't read their expressions. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said. "On the count of human trafficking, how do you find?" "Guilty." Sarah's breath caught. "On the count of assault causing serious bodily injury, how do you find?" "Guilty." One by one, the guilty verdicts came. Guilty on 8 counts, guilty on attempted murder, guilty on conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah didn't remember standing, but suddenly she was on her feet, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Around her, the other victims were crying too. Jennifer Hayes looked directly at the jury and mouthed, "Thank you." Robert Chambers sat at the defense table with an expression of pure rage. He'd believed his money and connections would protect him. He'd believed that women like Sarah would be too broken, too damaged, too unreliable to take down a man of his status. He'd been wrong. As the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos, the judge gaveling for order, lawyers gathering documents, victims and supporters embracing each other, Sarah turned to Marcus and collapsed against him. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over," he confirmed. But both of them understood that while the trial was over, the process of healing would take much longer. Robert would appeal. There would be more legal battles ahead. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah could breathe, knowing that her truth had been validated by a system that was supposed to serve justice. The legal process had worked, not perfectly, not without complications and frustrations, but ultimately it had worked. And that, Sarah understood, was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. The ranch looked different when they returned. Not. Physically, the bullet holes had been repaired, the property restored, but something fundamental had shifted. What had been Marcus's refuge, his isolated sanctuary from the world, had transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer a place to hide, it was a place to build. Sarah stood on the front porch on a cold December morning, watching the sun rise over the property she'd come to think of as home. 3 months had passed since the guilty verdict. Robert was scheduled to be sentenced in January, and there were already discussions about appeals and his legal team's next moves. But for now, there was a kind of peace. An earned peace that came from having fought and survived. Marcus emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down beside Sarah and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. His shoulder, the one where the hitman's bullet had passed through, was mostly healed, though he still favored it slightly in cold weather. "Jennifer called this morning," Sarah said. "She's starting a non-profit organization for survivors of intimate partner abuse. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in being part of it." Marcus studied her face. "Are you?" "I think so. Not immediately, not until I've had time to process everything, but eventually, yes. The idea of helping other women navigate what I went through, of using what happened to me as a foundation for something useful that feels right." "That sounds like you," Marcus said. They stood together in comfortable silence, both of them aware that this moment of peace was temporary. Life would continue. Complications would arise. Robert's appeals would eventually make their way through the legal system. The process of healing would stretch across years, not months. But for now, in this moment, they could simply exist together in a way that neither had thought possible. Inside the house, Marcus had begun planning renovations. Not a complete transformation, but a thoughtful evolution. He'd decided to open up the master bedroom, the space that had belonged entirely to him and Catherine, and create shared quarters. He'd removed Catherine's belongings from the closet and carefully packed them away, not in an act of denial, but in an act of transition. Those things belonged to a different chapter of his life. Sarah had brought almost nothing with her. Her entire life had fit into what could be carried. But over the past months, as she'd begun to rebuild, she'd started acquiring things: books, clothes that she chose for herself rather than clothes that were given to her, art that she wanted to look at, the physical accumulation of personal preference. Patricia called that evening with updates on the legal front. "Robert's legal team has filed for appeal, as expected," she said, "but their arguments are weak. They're essentially asking the court to overturn a verdict because the jury made the wrong decision about credibility. That's not grounds for appeal. The verdict's going to stand." "What about sentencing?" Marcus asked, putting the call on speaker so Sarah could hear. "He'll face significant prison time, minimum 15 years, possibly life depending on how the judge weighs the crimes. And that's before any state charges. What happened in Texas is separate from federal charges, and the state's been building its own case." "So he won't get out," Sarah said, her voice measured. "Robert Chambers will almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison," Patricia confirmed. "He made mistakes when he ordered your death. Those mistakes ensured that he wouldn't be able to use money and connections to escape justice." After Patricia hung up, Sarah went to the bookshelf in the living room and pulled down Catherine's journals. She'd been reading them slowly over the past months, trying to understand the woman Marcus had loved, trying to bridge the gap between the person he'd described and the person documented in those pages. What emerged from that reading was a picture of a woman caught between two worlds. Catherine had been strong enough to recognize that she was being abused, but not strong enough at that moment in time to leave. She'd been intelligent enough to document her fear, but not powerful enough to do anything about it. She'd found kindness to extend to Sarah, even while she herself was suffering. "I'm starting to understand her," Sarah said to Marcus one evening as they sat by the fire. "Catherine, I mean. I used to think she was weak because she stayed with Robert for so long. But reading her journals, I understand that she was gathering strength. She was planning her escape. She just ran out of time." "Do you think her stroke was natural?" Marcus asked, a question he'd been carrying since reading Catherine's journals. "I think it was stress-induced," Sarah said carefully. "Whether Robert directly caused it, or whether the constant pressure and fear contributed to it, I can't say definitively, but I think she was at the breaking point. She was about to leave him, and her body couldn't sustain the tension anymore." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I used to be angry at her for dying. I used to feel like she abandoned me. But now I realize she was just another one of his victims. She was just as much a casualty of his abuse as you are." "Ah," Sarah corrected gently. "Not were. I'm a survivor. And so was Catherine, up until the moment she couldn't be anymore. The winter deepened, and with it came a kind of settling. Sarah began working with a therapist, processing the trauma of her captivity and the violence she'd experienced. The process was slow and sometimes painful, but it was also essential. She was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting or minimizing what had happened. It was about integrating her trauma into her identity in a way that didn't define her entire self. Marcus, for his part, was learning to be present in ways he'd never been before. Catherine's death had taught him about the dangers of assuming someone was okay when they might be suffering. With Sarah, he was learning to check in, to listen, to understand that love meant paying attention even when things seemed normal on the surface. On a Saturday in January, they drove into Millbrook for the sentencing hearing. Robert received 25 years to life, with multiple concurrent sentences. The judge, in her remarks, noted that his attempt to murder potential witnesses represented a consciousness of guilt that compounded his initial crimes. In the courtroom gallery, Sarah sat beside Marcus and felt something settle. Not complete closure. Closure was a concept that suggested finality, and trauma didn't work that way. But there was a kind of punctuation, a moment where one chapter definitively ended. After the hearing, Jennifer Hayes approached Sarah outside the courthouse. "Thank you," Jennifer said simply, "for standing with me, for testifying, for not backing down when the defense attorney tried to make us doubt ourselves." "Thank you for going first," Sarah replied, "for showing me that surviving was possible, that standing up was possible." The two women embraced, and in that embrace was the recognition of what they'd survived together, not as victims, but as witnesses, not as broken people, but as people who'd chosen to fight. Over the following months, Sarah became increasingly involved with Jennifer's non-profit. She began training to become a counselor for abuse survivors, not with formal credentials yet, but through direct participation in support groups and individual consultation work. Her own experience gave her credibility that no professional credential could match. Marcus expanded the ranch, bringing in new ventures. He hired additional workers and created a system that allowed him to reduce his own day-to-day physical labor. At first, Sarah worried that he was overextending himself for her benefit. But Marcus was clear. The changes were for both of them. He wanted a life that included work, but wasn't defined entirely by work. He wanted space to be present, to build a partnership that was more than just surviving together. One afternoon in early spring, as they were planning renovations to the guest room, transforming it into an office where Sarah could work for the non-profit, Sarah asked Marcus a question that had been building in her mind. "Do you think about Catherine?" she asked, "since everything happened?" "Yes," Marcus said honestly, "but differently. I think about who she was, what she was enduring. I think about how I failed to see her suffering. But I'm not angry anymore. I understand that she was trapped the way you were trapped, just in a different kind of imprisonment." "Do you regret marrying her?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "No, I regret not paying closer attention. I regret not asking harder questions when she seemed distant or afraid. But I don't regret the marriage itself. Catherine made me who I am, and who I am is someone capable of standing beside you now." Sarah moved closer to him, and Marcus put his arm around her. They stood together in the room that had once been a guest space and was about to become something functional and shared. "I want to talk about what comes next," Sarah said. "Not just professionally with the non-profit, but for us personally. What are you thinking? Where do you see this going?" Marcus had been thinking about this for months. "I'm thinking about building a life that's deliberately constructed rather than accidentally created. I'm thinking about creating stability, not as an escape but as a foundation. I'm thinking about the possibility of marriage, if that's something you want. But I want to be clear about something first." "What?" "I don't want to marry you because I rescued you, or because you need rescuing. I want to marry you because you're the strongest person I know, because you make me want to be better, because despite everything that was taken, From you, you chose to build something meaningful, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I want that too. I want to build something with you, but not yet. Not until I feel more solid in myself. Not until I've done enough healing that I'm bringing wholeness to the partnership instead of just damage. However long that takes, Marcus said, I'll be here. By summer, the physical evidence of their life together had begun to manifest visibly. The renovated master bedroom, decorated with pieces that reflected both of them. The new office where Sarah worked on non-profit materials. The expanded kitchen where they cooked meals together. The porch where they sat in the evenings, watching the landscape shift through the seasons. But more than the physical changes, there was an emotional architecture being built. Trust that had been tested and survived. Communication that had been forged through crisis. Love that was being constructed not through passion alone, but through consistent choice. One evening in late summer, Sarah was doing paperwork for the non-profit when she discovered something in a box of documents that Patricia had sent over. It was a letter addressed to Marcus in Catherine's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before she died. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. She should probably give it to Marcus unopened, but something made her pause. The letter read, Marcus, if you're reading this, then I've managed to do what I've been planning for months. I've left Robert. I don't know where I'll go or how I'll survive, but I know I can't survive any longer in that situation. I want you to know that leaving you had nothing to do with you. You were always kind, always steady. But I couldn't be the woman you deserved because I was barely surviving being the woman Robert demanded I be. If something happens to me before I get to safety, I want you to know that I was trying, I was fighting, and I was grateful every day for the years we had together. You deserve someone who can give you everything. I hope you find her. Sarah sat with the letter for a long time, tears streaming down her face. She understood, in that moment, what Catherine had been trying to communicate. Catherine had loved Marcus, but she'd known that her damage was too profound for her to be the partner he needed. She'd been trying to set him free, and in a way, Catherine had. Her death had forced Marcus into isolation that had eventually led him to be available when Sarah needed him. It was a cruel kind of providence, but it was providence nonetheless. Sarah brought the letter to Marcus that evening. He read it 3 times before speaking. She was trying to protect me, he said finally. She was trying to make sure that her suffering didn't drag me down with her. She loved you, Sarah said, in the way she was capable of loving you at that moment. But she also understood that you deserved more than she could give. Marcus folded the letter carefully. And I've found more. Not because Catherine died, but because her death opened a door that allowed me to find you. Does that make sense? It does, Sarah said. It means that her suffering wasn't wasted. It means she helped break a cycle. She helped save other women by documenting what happened to her. That night, Marcus placed Catherine's letter in a safe place alongside her journals. Not as a memorial to their marriage, but as a testament to a woman who'd been trying until the very end to survive, trying to escape, trying to warn others about predators. As the summer turned toward fall, Sarah and Marcus settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. The non-profit work was growing. The ranch was thriving. Their relationship was deepening through the ordinary rhythms of shared life rather than through crisis. They had survived, both of them. They had been broken by different circumstances, but they had found each other in the wreckage, and, together, they were building something new. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because fairy tales suggest a permanent state of happiness. What Marcus and Sarah were building was more resilient than that. It was a life constructed from hard-won understanding of human vulnerability. It was a partnership built on the recognition that love meant showing up, even when it would have been easier to hide. The question of whether they would marry remained open. Sarah was still processing her trauma, still rebuilding her sense of self, but the promise of a future was no longer uncertain. It was something they were actively constructing, day by day, choice by choice. And in the quiet moments on the porch, watching the Texas landscape shift through the seasons, both understood that what they had was worth fighting for. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. 2 years after Sarah first collapsed in Marcus's barn, she stood in front of a room of 30 women and began to speak about survival. The setting was a community center in Houston, modest and practical. The women in the chairs ranged in age from 20 to 60, and they carried visible and invisible scars. Some were still in abusive relationships, gathering courage to leave. Others had recently escaped and were navigating the terrifying uncertainty of freedom. A few had been out for years and were trying to rebuild lives that had been systematically dismantled. "I'm not going to tell you that everything will be okay," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "because that would be a lie. Some days will be harder than others. Some days you'll wonder if you made a mistake by leaving. Some days you'll feel broken in ways you didn't know existed. But I'm going to tell you something else. You are stronger than the person who hurt you. And the proof is in the fact that you're here, asking for help, recognizing that you deserve better." Marcus watched from the back of the room, invisible to the participants. He'd attended dozens of these sessions over the past 2 years, always in the background, always present, never intrusive. He'd learned that his role wasn't to rescue anyone. It was simply to show up and demonstrate through his presence that there were people in the world who didn't require women to be perfect or whole in order to love them. Jennifer Hayes was also present, co-leading the session. The non-profit had grown beyond either of their initial expectations. They had satellite locations in 4 cities. They'd trained 20 counselors. They'd provided direct support to over 200 women. The ripple effects of Sarah's decision to testify had extended far beyond the courtroom. After the session, as Sarah was speaking with participants one-on-one, Marcus stepped outside for air. The Texas evening was warm, the kind of warmth that spoke of possibility rather than oppression. He found himself thinking about the man he'd been 2 years ago, isolated, grief-stricken, convinced that meaningful connection was something he'd lost forever. His phone buzzed with a text from the ranch manager. Everything was operating smoothly. The new cattle rotation was working. The water system was functioning optimally. The property that had been his escape was now simply his home, a place he valued but didn't hide in. When Sarah emerged from the building, she found Marcus leaning against the truck, watching the sunset. "How are you feeling?" he asked, knowing that the emotional labor of bearing witness to others' pain was exhausting. "Alive," Sarah said, "more alive than I've ever felt. Which is strange because I'm talking about abuse and trauma and pain, but somehow that's what makes me feel most present, like my suffering is being transformed into something useful." They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The highway stretched out before them, a path that had become familiar through repetition. What had once been a drive toward an uncertain future was now simply the commute to home. The ranch house came into view as the sun touched the horizon. Lights were on inside. They'd left them on specifically for this evening. The property had evolved visibly over 2 years. New fencing, improved structures, a greenhouse where Sarah was learning to grow herbs for personal use and eventually for selling to local restaurants. A small cabin where they hosted retreats for non-profit participants. The physical transformations were obvious, but the deeper transformation was something that couldn't be captured in photographs or architectural plans. It was visible only in the way Marcus and Sarah moved through space together, in the ease of their communication. In the evidence, everywhere, the 2 people had chosen to build something from the wreckage of their separate traumas. Inside, Sarah prepared dinner while Marcus reviewed financial documents related to the non-profit. They'd structured it carefully. Sarah held the position of Director of Counseling Services, while Patricia served as board president and handled legal matters. Jennifer focused on training and curriculum development. Together, they'd created an organization that was sustainable and that didn't depend entirely on Sarah's personal brand of survival. "David Chen called today," Sarah said as they ate. "He wanted to know if we'd be interested in consulting on a documentary about intimate partner abuse. They're looking for survivors willing to share their stories on camera." "Are you interested?" Marcus asked. "I'm considering it. There's value in visibility, but I also want to protect my privacy in ways I couldn't when I was testifying. It's complicated. You don't have to decide tonight," Marcus said, "or this month, or this year." Sarah smiled. It was one of the things she appreciated most about him, his understanding that healing wasn't a linear process with deadlines, that she could sit with decisions without being pressured into immediate resolution. After dinner, they sat on the porch that had become their ritual space. The evening was quiet, except for the sounds of the ranch horses shifting in the paddock, wind moving through the trees, the distant call of a night bird. These sounds, which had once felt lonely to Marcus, now felt like the rhythm of shared life. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, "about what comes next for us. Not immediately, but eventually." Marcus waited, sensing she needed to gather her thoughts. "I'm not ready to get married yet. I want to be clear about that. But I'm also not putting it off indefinitely. I think there's a future where I feel whole enough, present enough, that committing to that would feel like a choice rather than a coping mechanism. And when I get there, I want that future to include you." "I'll be here," Marcus said simply. "I know. That's why I can imagine a future with you, because you've proven consistently that your presence isn't contingent on me being a certain way or feeling a certain way. You're just here, and that changes everything." They sat in silence, and Marcus thought about Catherine. He'd been grieving her absence for 2 years before Sarah appeared. He'd assumed that the loss he'd experienced was the sum of what his life would contain. He'd built an identity around being a widow, around being broken, around being alone. Then Sarah had shown up in his barn, and everything had shifted. But it wasn't because Sarah completed him or fixed him. It was because Sarah's presence had forced him to move beyond his own grief long enough to see someone else's suffering. And in attempting to ease her suffering, he'd begun to ease his own. In choosing to stand beside her, he'd found a reason to stand at all. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found you in the ravine?" Sarah asked, echoing a question she'd posed to him years earlier. "Every day," Marcus said. "I think about how close I came to not being there. How, if I'd chosen a different path that morning, or if I'd given up searching after the first hour, our lives would have taken completely different trajectories. I think about it too. I think about how I could have died in that ravine, how Robert could have found me, how the trial could have gone differently. There are so many points where a different choice, a different timing, would have changed everything." "But you didn't die," Marcus said. "Robert was convicted. The trial went the way it did, and we're here, together, building something meaningful." "Which suggests," Sarah said slowly, "that maybe there's such a thing as grace, or luck, or the universe compensating for suffering with opportunity. I don't know what to call it, but something allowed us to survive, to find each other, to build this." The conversation drifted into lighter territory as the evening deepened. They talked about plans for the ranch, about a trip they were considering to the coast, about a book Sarah was reading and wanted to discuss. These were the conversations of people who'd moved beyond crisis into the ordinary texture of shared life. Later, as they prepared for bed, Sarah paused in front of the bedroom mirror. Her body had healed considerably over 2 years. The scars remained, they would always remain, but they no longer dominated her physical presence. They were part of her history, not her identity. "Do you know what I realized today?" she asked Marcus, "during the session with the women?" "What?" "I realized that I'm grateful. Not grateful that I was abused, not grateful that I suffered, but grateful that I survived it, that I fought back, that I'm using my experience to help others. I'm grateful to be alive in a way I wasn't before, because I understand now how fragile life is, how easily it can be taken, how precious it is when you've been close to losing it. Marcus pulled her close, and Sarah rested her head against his chest. "That's the most powerful thing I've heard you say," Marcus replied, "because gratitude means you've integrated what happened. It means you're not just surviving anymore. You're actually living." The months and years ahead held uncertainty, as all futures do. Robert would continue his appeals. The non-profit would face funding challenges and growth pains. Sarah and Marcus would continue to navigate the ordinary complications of building a shared life. But there would also be joy. There would be the moment when Sarah felt solid enough to say yes to marriage. There would be the expansion of the non-profit into new cities. There would be quiet evenings on the porch, watching the landscape shift through seasons, knowing that they'd earned the right to be there together. What Marcus and Sarah's story ultimately illustrates is something fundamental about human resilience. It's not about being unburdened by trauma or tragedy. It's about what you do when trauma arrives. It's about whether you allow it to define you or whether you transform it into something meaningful. It's about the recognition that sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we're expecting. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a stranger who chooses to stay when they could have called the authorities. Sometimes they show up as other survivors who understand your pain because they've lived through similar horrors. Sometimes salvation comes not from dramatic rescue, but from consistent, daily choice to stand beside someone while they rebuild. The scars Marcus and Sarah carry will never completely fade. But they've learned that scars aren't failures of healing. They're evidence that something broke, that recovery was possible, that a person continued despite everything working to prevent that continuation. In the quiet of the Texas night, two people who'd been brought together by tragedy sat together and knew, with absolute certainty, that they'd made the right choice. Not just to survive, but to build. Not just to endure, but to transform their endurance into purpose. That's the measure of a life, not the absence of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering be the final word. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.